Hey there. Tonight we are opening a door that should probably have stayed closed a little longer. In a quiet room full of clay dust and museum light, a scholar once noticed that the old Sumerian words for arrival did not sit on the tablet the way they were supposed to. They leaned. They trembled. They sounded less like a royal entrance and more like a family running through the dark with something close behind them. And once you see that, once you really let yourself see it, the whole Anunnaki story changes. The first cities look hurried. The first walls look nervous. Even the oldest king list begins to feel less like pride and more like a coded warning. If you enjoy these late-night journeys into dark old mysteries, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Then let the room grow a little dimmer. Let your breathing ease down into a slower rhythm. Unclench your jaw. Let your shoulders soften. Let the day drift a little farther away. We are not in a hurry tonight. We are going to sit with the oldest fear imaginable, the feeling that even the gods were looking over their shoulders. I have always found it strange that the most familiar version of the Anunnaki story feels almost too tidy. You probably know the outline. A powerful race arrives on Earth with a plan. They want resources. They want gold. They need workers. They set up their cities, divide their authority, and begin shaping the human story. It is clean, dramatic, and in a strange way reassuring. Conquest has rules. Colonization has intent. Even cruelty, when it is organized, feels easier for the mind to arrange on the shelf. But there is another possibility, darker and much softer around the edges, like a whisper heard through old stone. Imagine a tablet no larger than a serving platter, its surface crowded with wedge marks, pressed by a careful hand thousands of years ago. It sits now behind glass, under climate control, under polite, modern lighting, while visitors shuffle by in soft shoes and read a museum label in 10 seconds flat. Yet on that clay, in those little angled impressions, there may be a different emotional weather entirely. Not triumph, not ceremony. Panic, carefully hidden under royal language. The source behind our story tonight insists that the usual translation has missed this mood. Certain words long rendered as descent from heaven or arrival from the sky may carry another shade when read with more suspicion. The old terms do not simply imply beings who came down. They may suggest beings who fled, beings who sought shelter, beings who crossed a boundary not because they wished to expand, but because staying where they were had become impossible. And honestly, if you were standing here with me in the firelight, with a photograph of one of those tablets laid on the table between us, I think you would feel the chill of that idea right away. Not because it proves anything on its own. It does not. Some scholars would firmly disagree. It is debated. Ancient languages are slippery, and all translation is part patience, part writ. But once the possibility is spoken aloud, the old story begins to rearrange itself with unnerving ease. The Anunnaki did not come as conquerors. They came as refugees. That single turn changes the emotional weight of everything that follows. It means their first sight of Earth may not have been the cool evaluation of a superior species choosing a colony site. It may have been the ragged relief of travelers who finally found one world hidden enough, dense enough, and obscure enough to disappear inside. It means their choices, where to land, where to build, what to tell those beneath them, would all have been shaped by fear before ambition ever had a chance to settle in. Picture the descent. Not a shining invasion fleet arranged in perfect formation, but a wounded procession. Silent vessels gliding through the long dark between stars, carrying not only tools and plans, but exhaustion, maybe damage, maybe arguments, maybe old grief. Outside the hulls, nothing but distance and cold geometry. Inside, a civilization trying not to say the worst thought out loud. What if the hunters are still there? What if they followed? What if there is nowhere left to go after this? The source gives us little glimpses of this through language. A term usually translated as mission may really mean refuge. Another commonly softened into heavenly order may carry the scent of urgent necessity. There are references to pursuers from darkness, to forces that watched the paths between worlds, to a departure that feels constrained rather than chosen. The official narrative says dominion. The clay may be whispering shelter. And the oldest cities, those first footprints in Mesopotamia, begin to support the feeling. We often imagine the first Anunnaki settlements as grand beginnings, the sort of places where cosmic rulers stepped down and calmly laid out sacred geometry on the plain. But the archaeological mood, at least in the way this source reads it, is much more anxious. The earliest structures at Eridu do not always display the ceremonial precision you might expect from a confident founding. Some appear rough, rapidly assembled, practical in a way that feels almost human. The foundations seem more urgent than elegant. Alignment gives way to speed. A wall appears before a sanctuary, a perimeter before a palace. That detail is worth sitting with for a while, because it is one of those small things that can quietly turn a whole story inside out. If a people arrive in peace and certainty, they tend to mark the center first. A temple, a throne room, a formal axis between sky and earth. They announce themselves to the land and to one another. But if they arrive frightened, they mark the edges. They define a boundary. They watch the horizon. They build a place to hide what matters. You know that feeling when someone moves into a house in a hurry. The furniture is in the wrong room. The curtains are half hung. The doors get checked twice before bed. And the whole place carries that unsettled air of people telling each other they are safe before they actually believe it. The early Anunnaki cities, in this reading, feel a little like that. Cosmic refugees, pretending to be lords, because lords do not get asked what they are afraid of. The more I think about it, the more haunting the image becomes. Earth, in this version, is not the prize. It is the attic, the cellar, the distant farmhouse at the edge of the map where someone hopes the pursuers will not bother to look. And if that sounds almost too dramatic, too much like one of those ideas that enjoys its own darkness, then let the details calm it down again. Clay tablets, foundation stones, buried fortifications, repeated phrases about darkness, urgency, and shelter. Nothing thunderous, nothing cinematic, just enough to make the old polished story begin to crack. The source also stretches this beyond Sumer, which is where things become truly eerie. Similar patterns appear. It claims, In other ancient traditions, Egyptian texts, speaking of divine beings seeking the protection of the river, Hindu passages describing celestial entities retreating into the dense world of matter, Mesoamerican memories of first fathers arriving in a time of hiding. It is as if many old civilizations preserved one shared intuition, that the sky gods were not entirely free when they came here. That earth was not simply beneath them. It was between them and something worse. And once that thought takes root, even the familiar phrase from the sky begins to feel different. We hear it and imagine majesty, but the old listener might have heard escape. A deer runs from the tree line. A boat reaches shore before a storm. A people come from the sky because the sky itself is no longer safe. I find that deeply sad, in a way I did not expect when I first sat with this material. Because the gods of old are usually presented as the final authorities. But what if they were only the next frightened layer up? What if they carried power? Yes. And knowledge beyond human measure? Yes. But also the oldest burden of all, the memory of being chased. And perhaps that is why the source places so much weight on the Sumerian king list. Usually people treat it like a strange ancient chronology, with impossible rains and post-flood transitions and all the familiar fog of myth hanging around it. But if the earliest rulers were also the earliest refugees, then their exaggerated spans of rule may carry more than ceremony. They may preserve phases of waiting, watching, regrouping, long ages not of splendor, but of surviving one cycle at a time, while something remained uncomfortably unresolved beyond the edge of the world. There is also something almost domestic about the first moments after arrival that I cannot shake. The unpacking of a civilization under pressure. Crates opened in dim chambers. Instruments set down before anyone knows where they will finally belong. Maps unrolled across tables while dust settles on them. Sentinels posted. Breath held at every unfamiliar noise in the atmosphere. And then, very slowly, the posture changes. Fear is folded into ritual. Refuge is renamed dominion. Shelter becomes temple. The children born afterward are taught not that their elders ran, but that they descended. That is how civilizations protect their dignity. They rewrite the doorway through which they entered history. I do not even say that as criticism. It is almost tender. If you had crossed the dark carrying your whole world behind you, if you had buried your dead somewhere between stars and hidden your terror behind sacred language, would you tell the next generation that you came here trembling? Or would you give them a stronger story to live inside? Maybe that is what the clay has preserved. Not lies exactly. More like honorable disguises. The source makes one more important emotional move before the end of this opening stretch. It suggests that if the Anunnaki were hiding, then everything they later did on Earth, their engineering, their hierarchy, their strange interventions in human development, their rigid control over knowledge, their separation of classes, all of it might be less easily explained by arrogance alone. Some of it may have been defensive. Some of it may have been driven by the terrible knowledge that being found would mean something far worse than political inconvenience. That possibility casts a long shadow. It falls over the flood stories, over the building of cities, over the guarded heavens of old myth, over every account in which divine beings seem simultaneously powerful and unaccountably tense. It even falls over humanity itself. Because if the beings above us were not at ease, then the whole world they built around us may have been shaped by emergency logic from the beginning. And that is where I want to leave you for now. In that quiet unease, the fire is lower. The room is softer. Somewhere in the old alluvial dark of Mesopotamia, the first walls are going up in a hurry. Somewhere, a watcher is scanning the horizon before the temple has even received its first offering. Somewhere, a ruler, who will later be remembered as a god, is looking up into the night and hoping not to see a certain pattern of stars move, because in the next part, we walk into those first cities and look more closely at the stone itself. And the stone, if the source is right, does not remember a confident beginning. It remembers shelter. When you begin to look at the first cities through the lens of fear, everything changes its posture. A wall is no longer just a wall. It becomes a held breath in mud brick form. A tower is not only height, it is anxiety given corners. Even an empty stretch of packed earth between structures begins to feel deliberate, as if someone needed clear lines of sight more urgently than they needed beauty. That is the mood the source asks us to carry into Eridu, Uruk, and the earliest settlements tied to the Anunnaki story. Not triumphal beginnings, not orderly colonial expansion. Defensive improvisation beneath a sky that did not feel trustworthy. If you were standing here with me, I think I would ask you to imagine arriving at Eridu before sunrise. Not the famous site, as it appears in books, flattened into diagrams and phases and neat academic labels, but a raw place near water and salt wind, where the ground is still cool from the night and the first light is just beginning to touch broken edges of stone and hardened mud. There is a smell there in my imagination. Wet earth, mineral bitterness, old reeds, the faint memory of river breath. And under that almost peaceful atmosphere sits a disturbing idea. This may not have been built by beings calmly beginning a glorious project. It may have been thrown together by those who needed cover before they needed ceremony. The source leans on exactly that distinction. Excavations at the earliest levels of these sites reveal, in its reading, a construction logic that feels wrong for confident divine founders. We are used to hearing that sacred builders begin with alignment, with cosmic order, with precise relation to sky and horizon. Later Mesopotamian architecture certainly does carry that flavor. But the earlier patterns, at least as the source tells them, show urgency. Stones laid fast, materials used as they come, foundations lacking the elegant astronomical care found in more mature structures. That shift may sound dry in summary, but in a story like this, it becomes deeply intimate. It means somebody chose speed over symbolism, and speed is always a kind of confession. I have always found it revealing that fear leaves signatures even when a culture tries to hide them behind grandeur later. You can cover rough foundations with beautiful upper walls. You can bury a first panic under a later theology. But the earliest layer still keeps its own nervous memory. The source suggests that this is exactly what happened in the first Anunnaki settlements. They arrived. They built. They secured themselves. Then, once breathing became easier, they told a more regal story about why. At Eridu, the details begin quietly. Earlier structures appear simpler, less ceremonially arranged, more practical. Then the wider pattern emerges. Defensive walls and watch positions seem to appear before the sorts of temple-centered monumental forms one would expect if cosmic rulers had come to establish dominion in leisurely confidence. That is a subtle point, but it matters a great deal. A people worried about rule begin with the center. A people worried about attack begin with the edge. And edge is a very different kind of sacred. Imagine workers in the dim blue hour carrying mud brick not toward a shining sanctuary, but toward a perimeter line. No chance yet. No great dedication. Only movement. Repetition. The soft thud of shaped earth set into place. The occasional glance upward. Someone higher in rank, tracing a boundary with a staff or with a hand motion. Someone else deciding where sightlines meet. Someone calculating how far a warning can travel from tower to tower. All of that before the main holy structure is allowed to take its full shape. If that is true, the city begins not as a gift to heaven, but as a brace against it. That idea follows us to Uruk, where the source points to buried fortifications beneath later city layers. This is the kind of detail that belongs perfectly in a sleep story, because it carries its own depth of time inside it. A city above. Another concern below. A polished civilization eventually rising over the hushed remains of an older defensive mood. Ground-penetrating radar. The modern phrase sounds so clinical, almost boring. And yet the image it creates is not boring at all. The earth holding earlier lines. Walls beneath walls. The first answer to danger, hidden underneath the later answer to power. There is something almost touching in that, the way civilizations bury their fear under their confidence. You can imagine the later inhabitants walking above those forgotten defenses without fully feeling what lay beneath their sandals. Market noise above, old alarm below, priests carrying offerings above, early sentries once scanning the horizon below. It happens in human life too. A person survives something terrible, builds a graceful life on top of it. And years later, the old fortifications are still there under the floorboards. Quiet, useful, never fully dismantled. That, I think, is how the Source wants us to understand the first Anunnaki cities. Not as false, just layered. First shelter, then rulership. First fear. Then ideology. And once this pattern is seen in Mesopotamia, the Source begins reaching outward across the ancient world, which is where the story grows beautifully uncanny. Egypt comes first. Not the familiar Egypt of perfect symmetry and dazzling confidence, but an older memory preserved in temple language of divine beings seeking the protection of the sacred river. I find that phrase almost heartbreaking. Seeking the protection of the river, not commanding it, not descending to own it, seeking it. The Nile, in this frame, becomes not merely a gift of gods, but a natural shield chosen by gods who themselves required shelter. There is a softness to that image. The river winding through heat, offering barriers, fertile margins, a place where approach routes can be watched. Then the Source moves to Hindu traditions, where certain divine beings are described as retreating into the realm of dense matter during cosmic conflict. Dense matter. What a strange and lovely phrase that is for Earth. especially if you imagine it spoken by beings accustomed to moving across wider celestial spaces. Earth as the heavy place, the quiet, hidden place, the planet where one might disappear into gravity, mountain, cloud, and flesh. And then Mesoamerica enters with its own dark version of the pattern. The first fathers arrive in a time of hiding. Feathered serpent figures lead people not toward convenience, but toward concealment. Cities rise where they can be hidden, defended, or protected by terrain. The source clearly wants us to see not isolated myths, but a repeated emotional geometry. Sky beings, pursuit, shelter, defensible settlement, watchfulness that never fully relaxes. If all of that were only one culture, one tablet, one poetic line, perhaps it would feel flimsy. But repetition changes texture. A single echo may be accident. Many echoes begin to sound like architecture. Some scholars would still resist this strongly, and with reason. Similar myths can emerge independently. Human beings everywhere know exile, fear, and weather. We also project those things upward. It is debated. We should keep our feet on the ground even while the story looks toward the stars. Yet there is still something difficult to ignore in the emotional consistency of these accounts. The gods in these traditions so often behave less like calm founders and more like displaced elites trying to recreate order in a place chosen partly for its defensibility. That word matters too. Defensibility. Not comfort. Not beauty. Not symbolic purity. The source claims the archaeology reflects precisely that. Try for a moment to imagine how such a city would feel to live in during its earliest years. The walls still fresh, the towers watchful, the people inside aware, even if only vaguely, that the forms around them exist for reasons no one wants to describe too plainly. Children running across packed ground, while adults keep one eye on the horizon. The temple, perhaps present, but not yet grand enough to distract from the perimeter. Nightfall carrying not only stars, but calculation. Which sectors are visible? Which approaches stay dark? Whether a certain point of light moves too quickly, or too steadily, or not quite like the others. That is one of the recurring motifs I want to carry for you tonight. The nervous horizon. It transforms even ordinary actions. Fetching water becomes passing under a tower. Lighting a lamp becomes something done with awareness of how far its glow carries. Opening a gate at dawn becomes a gesture wrapped in old caution. The source may be telling a large cosmic story, but the emotional power of it comes from these very small changes in daily life. Civilization built by refugees always sounds different at ground level than it does in formal myth. The source says something else, perhaps without intending to say it so tenderly. If these beings came here under pressure, then Earth may have changed them as much as they changed Earth. Refuge has a way of remaking pride. Once you depend on terrain, weather, and local conditions to survive, you are no longer simply master of a place. You are bound to it. Perhaps that is part of why the earliest settlements later become sacred centers. Gratitude and dependence often borrow the language of holiness. By now, the room around you should feel settled enough that these old cities can rise slowly in the mind. Eridu in first light, Uruk with buried caution under later glory, Nile Edge sanctuaries chosen as if rivers could protect even gods, hidden mountain sites in older Indian memory, concealed first cities beneath the breath of Mesoamerican jungle and stone. Not separate tales exactly, variations on one mood. And once you let that mood settle, another thought arrives almost on its own. If the first settlements were this defensive, then the danger was not only distant, it must have remained imaginable after arrival. No one builds like that for a threat they are certain has vanished forever. The walls say more than, "We were afraid once." They say, "We may need this again." That detail darkens everything. It means the first city is not just a shelter. It is a waiting room. The source hints at that through all its repeated references to watchfulness. Watchtowers before palaces, buried fortifications beneath ceremonial layers, traditions in multiple cultures describing continued vigilance, settlements chosen less for splendor than for concealment or strategic value. The pattern suggests that Earth was not only a hiding place once, it remained a hiding place. The sky above was never allowed to become entirely innocent again. I think that is why the first architecture matters so much in this story. It is the emotional evidence. Language can be debated. Myths can be symbolic. But the order in which things are built, that is intimate. That is behavior, and behavior reveals what official narrative often tries to smooth away. So let us linger one last moment in one of those early compounds, the walls still damp in places from recent work, the tower ladder rough under the hands, the smell of clay, reed fiber, smoke, and night air. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, silence over the marsh. Somewhere inside, a map unrolled under lamplight. The people in charge speaking low, not about ceremony first, but about sightlines, entrance, hidden routes, and how long they have before something might notice where they are. That is the world the source wants us to step into. And in the next part, that fear deepens, because the danger was not only outside the walls. It began entering the minds of the workers below the earth, in the deep places where whispers from the void started teaching the wrong people how to look up. The trouble with a city built for shelter is that fear does not stop at the walls. It seeps inward. It travels through corridors, under doors, along work gangs and supply paths, and whispered conversations at the edge of firelight. In the story we are following tonight, that inward seepage becomes one of the darkest turns of all, because the danger that once chased the Anunnaki across the sky may have found another way to reach them. Not through direct assault at first, through listening, through influence, through the tired minds of those who labored far below the surface, where no one important was supposed to be paying much attention. The source gives that hidden turn a name many listeners already know: the Igigi Rebellion. Usually it is told as a labor story. The workers grow weary. The burden becomes too much. The lower class rises against the divine supervisors above them. It is dramatic enough in its familiar form, and honestly, I understand why it endured. Labor disputes are human. Even gods become easier to understand when they start acting like exhausted managers and angry workers. But the source is not satisfied with that version. It argues that the rebellion when read through certain textual cracks, was not simple at all. It was infiltration. It was persuasion from outside. It was a fracture opened deliberately inside a frightened civilization that could not afford another crack. If you were standing here with me, I would ask you to imagine the mining works before anything goes wrong. Not the grand upper city with walls and towers and priests drifting in the lamplit courts. I mean the deep places. Shafts cut into old stone. Air growing cooler as the descent continues. The smell of metal and damp earth. The distant tap of tools. Voices flattened by echo. Lamps carried low, the flames wavering whenever some unseen current of underground air brushes past. The workers here do not live in the same mental world as those above. The sky is an idea to them. The wall of stone is immediate. Their days narrow into labor, breath, fatigue, and the small rituals that keep a body steady in darkness. That is important, because people who live far from the center of power often hear things first that the center does not yet know how to name. The source points to exactly that. Certain lines in the old texts, it says, have been mistranslated so consistently that the whole emotional logic of the rebellion has been blurred. A passage usually softened into understanding through instruction may mean something much colder. Understanding through that which penetrates from the void. Not teaching in the ordinary sense. Infiltration. Something crossing the distance. Something entering minds that were tired enough, isolated enough, and wounded enough to be altered. I have always thought that ideas arriving in darkness feel worse than weapons. A weapon at least declares itself. A whisper lets you wonder which thoughts are still yours. Picture one worker at the end of a shift. Shoulders aching. Dust on his skin. A bowl of water in his hands, muddy around the rim. The others settling, eating, resting, saying very little because the body leaves no extra strength for speech. Then while the lamps burn lower and the tunnels hold their own quiet pressure, a thought enters with a texture that does not feel entirely self-made. Not a command exactly. More like a realization. A quick widening. A sense that the sky above is not only distant, but hidden. A sense that those who rule have kept something back. A sense that the darkness beyond the world is not empty, but attentive. In the source. That is how the rebellion begins to change shape. The Igigi do not simply become angry. They become informed. That is much more dangerous. The old records, in this telling, describe them suddenly demonstrating knowledge that should have been beyond their station. They begin constructing devices for watching the heavens. They work with materials and methods never openly taught to them. They act with a coordination far too clean for a scattered labor protest across vast distances. Separate work sites cease together. Separate crews begin similar actions within the same narrow window of time. The source sees orchestration in that, and once you start imagining it, the coordination does feel unnerving. This is not men throwing down tools in the heat of one shared afternoon. It is many underground minds turning at once toward the same forbidden horizon. The phrase the source lingers on is beautiful in a terrible way. The making of the sky eyes. There is almost tenderness in it, until you remember what it means. Instruments. observers, things built in secret by those never meant to look outward on their own. The laborers below the earth begin making devices not for extraction, not for daily survival, but for seeing what moves between the stars. And right there, the whole rebellion stops looking social and starts looking strategic. Imagine the workshop hidden inside the deeper chambers. Tool fragments set aside for another use. Metal heated softly, so the wrong overseer will not notice too much smoke. Shapes filed with patient urgency. Curved surfaces polished more carefully than any mining task would require. Lenses, perhaps, or mirrored plates, or fittings for instruments whose true use only a few understand at first. The workers gather around these half-made objects with the hushed intensity people reserve for contraband and revelation. They are tired, yes, but now they are illuminated from inside by a new, terrible privilege. They know something, or they think they do, and once a neglected class believes it has finally touched hidden truth. The world above rarely stays stable for long. The source says the whispers from the void played a central role in this transformation. I find that phrase impossible to forget. Voices that travel through the emptiness between worlds. Not thunder, not oracle in the temple sense. Something colder, more directional, more like signal than revelation. These communications, according to the source, told the workers things they had not been told by their Anunnaki superiors. That the great ones above were not secure. That they were hunted. That their defenses had weaknesses. That there were those out in the dark who watched, waited, and could perhaps be guided here. Once that enters the story, the rebellion becomes terrifyingly clear. The Igigi are not merely resisting labor. They are becoming the opening through which the hunters may see. And because the source wants us to feel the precision of it, it adds another layer. The workers begin choosing their camps and instruments with knowledge of gaps in the Anunnaki surveillance network. They monitor the very same sectors of the heavens that the ruling class watches. They predict celestial disturbances. They identify dark wanderers, invisible to ordinary observers. They behave not like miners who stumbled into anger, but like a compromised population given tactical instruction by an intelligence already familiar with the defensive system it intends to penetrate. The source also says some of the workers built what it calls sky revealers, devices meant to broadcast into the void. Take a moment with that image. A chamber beneath the earth. A machine assembled from stolen materials and impossible instruction. Its surfaces humming faintly. A ring, or frame, or set of aligned plates aimed not upward in the open air, but calibrated below and within, as though direction itself can be folded when the right principles are known. Around it stand workers who no longer understand where their own grievance ends and a colder mission begins. They activate something, or prepare to, not to speak to heaven in prayer, but to tell the dark where earth is hiding. No wonder the Anunnaki responded violently. The source says they had to fight on two fronts at once. The rebellion before them, the cosmic threat beyond them. That detail gives the whole scene an almost unbearable pressure. Imagine leadership in the upper city receiving reports one after another. The workers have stopped. The workers are building instruments. The workers know too much. The workers are watching the wrong parts of the sky. Then perhaps the final horror. They may be trying to reveal our position. Everything after that moves with the hard speed of emergency. The source describes concealment protocols, darkening of star paths, defensive measures to hide Earth's signatures from long-range detection. There are even references to technologies of forgetting, devices or procedures that could disrupt memory and thought selectively. That is one of the bleakest details in the whole material, because it turns the suppression of the rebellion into something more intimate than punishment. The rebels are not merely broken, they are dimmed. Their dangerous knowing is burned out of them while basic function remains. A forgetting fire, a phrase soft enough to be almost beautiful, until you think about it too long. Honestly, the image stays with me more than the weapons do. A worker kneeling in dim light, head bowed, not in worship, but in the aftermath of forced erasure. He knows there was something he had learned, something wide and cold and urgent, but it is slipping away even as he reaches for it. Around him, the others sit or lie in the same broken quiet. Memory has edges now. Whole regions inside the mind feel scraped. The stars above return to being unreachable. The strange instruments lie dismantled. The great hidden war withdraws from immediate awareness. But not perfectly. Never perfectly. The source says some remembered. Fragments. Whispers. Enough to remain dangerous. Enough to form exiled groups beyond the settled lands. People who still carried the ache of the void speakers and watched for their return. That detail gives the ending of this section its lingering sorrow. The rebellion is stopped, but the contamination of knowledge cannot be entirely undone. Once people have glimpsed that their rulers are hiding from something, obedience never fully returns to its older shape. And that, perhaps, is why humanity enters the story next in such a significant way. According to the source, the creation of human labor may not have been convenience alone. It may have been security. Humans, unlike the Igigi, lacked the same natural sensitivity to cosmic influence. They were easier to limit, easier to separate from advanced astronomical knowledge, easier to keep within boundaries that reduce the risk of another infiltration from the void. In this reading, humanity is born not only from need, but from institutional paranoia. That changes the emotional meaning of our creation too, does it not? We are not simply made to work. We are made because another workforce learned too much. The firelight here feels right for that thought. Quiet, low, almost embarrassed by what it illuminates. Because it means human civilization may have begun inside a defensive redesign. Our limits built partly on purpose. Our ignorance woven in as a safeguard. Our distance from the stars not only biological, but administrative. That is where I want to leave you at the edge of this part, with the tunnels growing still again, the rebellion crushed but not entirely forgotten, and the first human laborers beginning to move into a world already shaped by secrecy. Above them, the Anunnaki tighten their control. Beyond them, the hunters remain unseen. And in the next movement of the story, the sky opens, wider still, because the rebellion below was only one front in a much older and far stranger war. A war remembered in Enoch, in winged battle scenes, and in stories of watchers descending not to bless the earth, but to prepare it for conflict. Once the whispers in the deep tunnels have done their work, the story can no longer remain underground. It has to rise into scripture, into battle scenes, into those old fragments from scattered civilizations that seem, when read alone, almost too extravagant to trust, and when read together, far too consistent to ignore comfortably. This is the point where the source widens its frame and says, in effect, that the Anunnaki did not merely hide on Earth and struggle with unrest among their workers. They arrived in the middle of a larger war. The rebellion below was sabotage within an active theater of conflict. The beings remembered later as Watchers, angels, star lords, feathered powers, and sky warriors were not symbols circling morality tales. They were participants. The source begins this widening with the Book of Enoch. That choice makes sense. Enoch already feels like a text with 1 foot in theology and 1 foot in an intelligence briefing. It names, it lists, it describes descent, instruction, forbidden knowledge, altered offspring, punishment, and a world placed under strange observation. In more familiar religious reading, the Watchers are fallen beings who break divine law and corrupt humanity. But the source takes a sharper angle. It suggests that these Watchers were not simply rebellious spirits. They were reconnaissance units, advanced entities descending with purpose, setting up observation posts, preparing the field for a greater conflict already unfolding above and around the Earth. If you were standing here with me, I would ask you to picture Mount Hermon not as a lovely devotional backdrop, but as a forward operating position. Cold air, high stone, a sky close enough to make the body feel exposed. A group descending not in holiness, as later paintings imagine it, but in calculated silence. Equipment carried or projected. Landing concealed as much as possible. Eyes sweeping terrain. Measurements taken. Routes noted. Resources assessed. Human populations below identified not as children of God, in the later sentimental sense, but as variables, allies, breeding stock, liabilities, witnesses, perhaps all at once depending on the needs of the moment. That is a hard image, but a useful one if we are to stay faithful to the source. Because the Watchers in this narrative are profoundly practical. They teach metallurgy, not because shiny things are interesting, but because war needs metal. They teach astronomy, not because wonder is noble, but because tracking movement through the heavens matters. They produce hybrids, not merely out of desire or corruption in the moralizing later frame, but as part of a strategic response. The Nephilim, in this interpretation, are not just monstrous children of taboo unions. They are engineered beings, products of deliberate crossing, designed to carry strengths needed in a world under threat. I have always found that possibility more sorrowful than lurid. Imagine being made for war before your world has words for what war at that scale means. Made taller, stronger, sharper, more capable of sensing what ordinary humans cannot. Not as an act of love, not even exactly as an act of cruelty, as an act of urgency. A civilization under pursuit, deciding that native biology must be altered if the planet is to remain defensible. The source supports this with cross-cultural echoes, and once again, it is the repetition that gives the mood its force. Mesopotamian cylinder seals showing winged beings in conflict. Egyptian memories of sky powers and serpent enemies. Norse gods arriving, already shadowed by devourers of light. Hindu epics describing aerial vehicles, radiant weapons, and battles in the age before the Great Submersion. Celtic accounts of divine arrivals in dark clouds and enemies from beyond ordinary shores. The source wants us to feel the same memory surfacing under many costumes. And if that sounds too sweeping, too neat, then slow down with me and look not at the names first, but at the emotional structure. Something comes from above. It is advanced. It is not alone. It has enemies. It teaches selected humans. It fortifies strongholds. It breeds defenders or empowers chosen bloodlines. It fights in the air. It fears detection. It prepares for cataclysm. Then later generations remember the conflict as gods and monsters because that is the only language broad enough to hold the remains. That pattern appears again and again. The source lingers for a while on visual evidence, especially the cylinder seals. I think this is wise because they give the imagination somewhere to stand. Little carved surfaces, no larger than a hand. And yet, they preserve scenes of winged figures engaging in what looks far less like ceremony than like maneuver. Formations, different body types, distinct adversaries, some more feathered, some more serpentine, some almost geometric in a way that feels less biological than engineered. If you let the modern mind drift too far into comfort, you dismiss all of it as ornamental myth art. But if you sit with the strangeness, these become tiny battle reports turned into image. Imagine one seal being rolled into wet clay by a scribe or official who already knows what the forms mean. A central winged figure, another attacking from an angle. Ground structures below. Projectiles or beams extending in unnervingly straight lines. The surface is small, but the memory behind it is not. Somewhere in the city, an administrative act takes place. Goods counted, orders given, names recorded, and the same seal that authorizes the transaction also carries the iconography of aerial war. That is extraordinary. It suggests that the conflict is not peripheral myth. It is part of how authority sees itself. The source also draws attention to weapons. Always carefully, but insistently. Spears that never miss. Hammers that return. Fires that poison air. Light that kills by looking. Nets that capture not metaphorical chaos, but detectable targets. Winds that act less like weather and more like directed systems. In the softer language of later faith, these become magical or divine attributes. In the source, they lean technological. Advanced projectiles, directed energy, surveillance instruments, shielding mechanisms, tactical arrays described by cultures with no stable engineering vocabulary for them. You know that feeling when someone in an old text tries to describe a machine with the nearest natural image. A wheel becomes a sun. A thruster becomes fire. A field effect becomes radiance. A sensor becomes an eye. That translation pressure may be part of why the myths feel both beautiful and unsatisfactory. They preserve effect more clearly than mechanism. One of the most haunting details in the source is the emphasis on stealth. The enemies of the Anunnaki and their allies are repeatedly described as beings who move in darkness, who devour light, who walk in the spaces where sight fails, who track without revealing themselves. This is not the emotional texture of primitive terror before a thunderstorm. It is the emotional texture of facing an enemy whose approach you cannot easily detect. An enemy with concealment. An enemy whose presence must be inferred from distortions, disappearances, pressure changes, anomalous skies, missing light. No wonder so much of the war turns toward observation. The Watchers are Watchers because watching is survival. The hybrid warriors are built for senses beyond ordinary human thresholds, because ordinary human thresholds are inadequate. The first fortresses are hidden. The deep workers are dangerous once they learn to make sky eyes. Everything in the source points to one desperate principle. See them before they see you, or at least before they fully arrive. If you were standing here with me now, perhaps with the fire gone lower and the candlelight making the room feel a little older than it is, I would ask you to imagine one of those early warning nights. No battle yet, only waiting. A ridgeline. A small group posted there, one hybrid figure among them, taller, stiller, eyes adjusted to some difference no pure human possesses. The others watching the sky and seeing only stars. That one feeling something else first. A dimming. A distortion. A pattern where no pattern should be. Then the report goes down the line. Not loud. Not dramatic. Simply, they are near. There is a kind of tenderness in such scenes, even though they belong to war. Shared vigilance creates its own intimacy. Entire civilizations, bound not only by faith or trade or kinship, but by the mutual need to remain unspotted a little longer. The source then expands even farther. It says these conflicts were not local, not symbolic, but global. The same categories of battle appear in mythic material from far separated cultures because the events themselves were widespread. This is where the story takes on its most enormous scale. Earth, not as one settlement world among many, but as an active battleground where multiple factions established footholds, observation systems, breeding programs, and strongholds across continents. Not every culture remembers the same names, but many remember the same feeling. Sky war, gifted knowledge, strange bloodlines, catastrophe to follow. That catastrophe is always waiting behind the battle scenes. You can feel it in the source before it is fully named. The conflicts become too large, the weapons too severe, the technologies too destabilizing. At some point, if the source is right, the war no longer remains only in the air. It begins reshaping the planet itself. Flood memory, sky fire, poisoned air, burned places, underground refuge. Those later threads are coming, but already in this part, you can sense that the Earth is being prepared not just for defense, but for survival after something overwhelming. Which brings us naturally toward the underground world of Enki, though we are not fully descending there yet. For now, it is enough to see how the war above would make such a descent inevitable. If the sky is watched, if the enemies can see through darkness, devour light, and track from the void. If the Watchers themselves are only one branch of a much larger campaign, then no surface city, however well fortified, can remain the final answer forever. Sooner or later, safety must become depth. The source gives us one more soft but chilling image before that descent. Multiple factions in the sky, not simply gods versus demons. More complicated than that. Winged figures of different forms and origins. Some aligned with the Anunnaki. Some aligned with the pursuers. Some perhaps allied only for a season. That political complexity makes the whole story feel more believable in emotional terms. Real conflicts are messy. Alliances shift. Not every arrival is salvation. Not every descent means help. Earth, in this reading, is a frontier where frightened powers with superior tools keep making temporary arrangements under extreme pressure. And in the middle of it all are humans. Not yet rulers. Not yet fully informed. Pulled into the conflict through labor, breeding, teaching, secrecy, and the inheritance of stories far older than their own institutions. Human beings, in this stage of the narrative, are not the audience. They are terrain, workforce, witness, and eventually participant. That too is sad in a very ancient way. To be born inside a war you do not understand, and receive fragments of divine explanation that are really only fragments of strategy. That may be why the old myths feel so fractured. We inherited the edges of a briefing, not the whole document. So let us end this section, where the surface world begins to fail as sufficient cover. The Watchers have descended. The sky wars have widened. Hybrid defenders have been made. Seals, scriptures, and later myths all preserve the same haunted grammar of aerial conflict. Above the first cities, the heavens no longer belong to peace. They belong to surveillance, maneuver, and threat. And beneath those cities, beneath temple and throne and market and wall, another world is already waiting. The deep concealed architecture of survival. Enki's hidden domain under the earth, where the hunted gods intend to vanish when the sky grows too dangerous to bear. The deeper the source goes, the more it begins to speak in the language of beneath. Not metaphor beneath. Not merely spiritual depth. Actual descent. Stone over the head. Air changing its taste. Light narrowing into controlled lines. The story has been preparing us for this for a long time. First the hunted arrival. Then the hurried cities. Then the infiltration of the workers. Then the widening war in the sky. Once all of that is allowed to stand in the mind at once, the underground world no longer feels like a poetic extra. It feels inevitable. This is where Enki's Abzu becomes the center of the story. Most people hear that word and imagine a mythic, watery underworld, a hidden, fresh depth beneath the earth associated with wisdom, origins, and secret realms. The source asks us to see something far more concrete and, in its own quiet way, far more unsettling. Not only a sacred domain, but a subterranean defense system. A network of concealed installations built to keep the hunted alive while the sky remained dangerous. The old references to deep water. In this interpretation, are not always about liquid as we would mean it. They may describe energy flows, concealed systems, inner currents of power moving through chambers buried well beyond the reach of ordinary surface life. If you were standing here with me, I would ask you to imagine entering one of these places very slowly. First, the surface temple. Respectable, ceremonial, easy for later ages to understand. Stone in sunlight. Processional space. A place where offerings can be made and hymns can be sung and all the visible machinery of religion can continue undisturbed. Then somewhere behind or beneath it, a shaft, a hidden descent, a controlled passage not intended for everyone. The air cools immediately. The dust changes. Footsteps no longer sound loose and open, but tight, returned by curved walls. The smell shifts too, less like earth after sun and more like mineral cold. Enclosed stone, metal that has slept in darkness for a very long time. The source points to Eridu first. Of course, it almost has to. Eridu is traditionally described as one of the oldest sacred centers, linked to Enki from the earliest memory. But in the source's reading, the site above is only the polite, visible portion of something much older and stranger below. Ground-penetrating radar, buried voids, immense subterranean features, reaching far deeper than a normal temple foundation has any need to reach. The source treats this not as symbolic underworld talk made physical by modern imagination, but as the archaeological shadow of a real, hidden complex. Chambers, curved architecture, deep installations, defensive geometry. That detail about curves matters more than it may seem. Surface civilizations often love right angles because they satisfy administration, storage, streets, and visual order. But if a place is built to resist pressure, to scatter detection, to survive collapse, then curvature begins to make another kind of sense. The source makes much of this, and I understand why. It lets the underground architecture feel like engineering before it feels like theology. Domed chambers, rounded walls, structural choices made for function rather than display. This is not the language of priests designing a pleasant metaphor for cosmic mystery. It is the language of people who expect impact, surveillance, or assault. The source says some hymns to Enki may do exactly that. Phrases long read as lovely religious poetry, waters that conceal, halls where sound dies, chambers hidden from the gaze of heaven, begin to look more like descriptions of stealth systems, acoustic dampening, concealment fields, and engineered invisibility once the defensive frame is applied. The beauty remains. But underneath it, another use becomes visible. A hymn may still be a hymn and a record of infrastructure at the same time. Picture the first chamber opening under your lamp, a vast space, unexpectedly smooth. The ceiling not jagged like a natural cave, but intentionally shaped. In the walls, veins of material unlike the stone around it. Metallic, perhaps, or simply different in a way the eye notices before the mind decides what to call it. The room seems to swallow noise. Even a cough arrives strangely softened. Even the flame appears calmer, as if the air itself has been taught to behave. Then further in, passages split, some descending deeper. some turning toward secondary halls, some leading toward chambers where energy once moved in ways the old scribes could only call rivers. That image of underground rivers is one of the loveliest in the whole source. In a conventional reading, it means hidden waters, fresh depths, the life-giving underworld streams of Enki's realm. In this darker reading, it may mean channels of power, internal flow systems, concealed distribution lines carrying energy from deeper engines to the outer defensive shell of the installation. The source even treats some references to flowing hidden force as evidence that the Abzu was powered, not merely occupied. A shelter is one thing. A shelter that can generate its own protection, air, and life support is something much more sophisticated. And once that thought is allowed in, the whole underground system becomes almost heartbreakingly human in its purpose. Not a throne room for smug rulers, a bunker for people who do not trust the sky. The source leans into that emotional truth repeatedly. Filtration systems described in poetic language, hidden breathways that cleanse poison, chambers where those below can continue living even while the world above is burning, darkened, or contaminated. It is very hard not to hear the echo of emergency planning in those descriptions. Gardens without sunlight, water or its equivalent circulating within sealed systems, halls large enough to sustain whole populations for long periods. Communication routes through stone, so that even when the surface is lost, the network below can continue to think, coordinate, and wait. You know that feeling when a place built for survival becomes more intimate than the homes above it. People sleep there, whisper there, raise children there in the intervals between danger. They begin by entering it as refuge and end by carrying some of its silence inside them forever. I imagine that would have happened here too. The first descent into the Abzu might have been full of panic, but the second, third, and 20th would have become ritualized. A culture of below would form. Quiet rules, quiet footsteps, quiet ways of speaking about what happened overhead. And perhaps dreamlike is appropriate, because underground worlds always carry that double feeling. Safety and estrangement. The body relaxes because the stone is thick. The mind tenses because the sky has been surrendered. The source then gives us the practical details of that surrender. Hidden ventilation, long-distance conduit, special materials in the walls chosen not for ornament, but for what they do to sound, signal, and detection. Whole sections built to scatter or absorb the equivalent of searching eyes. I do not know how literally all of that can or should be taken. Some scholars would say much of this is overreach. We cannot be sure, yet the emotional coherence is undeniable. If a superior sky-based enemy were tracking you across worlds, you would not merely go underground. You would go underground intelligently. That word, intelligently, is what keeps the Abzu from collapsing back into simple myth in the source's hands. These are not caves found by chance. They are systems, planned, powered, linked, layered, and in some traditions, large enough to hold not just elites but populations. The Sumerian king list and related texts contain those strange phrases about rulers dwelling in deep places during skyfire. Traditional readings can spiritualize that easily. The source says, do not rush. Let the sentence sit in its plainest physical form first. The rulers went below because above was not survivable. I think that plainness gives the whole section its strength. Picture a city hearing the warning. Not all at once, perhaps, but fast enough. Certain officials informed. Certain routes opened. Families moved in disciplined waves. Sacred objects carried not upward to some hilltop, but downward into cool, protected spaces. Surface lights extinguished. Observation posts sealed. The last teams below hearing the great doors, if doors they were, settle into place behind them. And then waiting. Just waiting. Listening to the slow systems hum while no one knows yet whether the attack will pass, strike elsewhere, or find them after all. This is where the source grows almost tender in its description of life support. Air cleaned, water cycled, food produced in darkness or controlled light. Places for thousands, places for years. The old texts, with their images of endless cauldrons, hidden gardens, and springs that do not fail, become in this reading not fairy abundance, but engineering necessity. If the war above could last, and if the catastrophes tied to it could poison earth, air, or open water, then the underground world needed to become a complete imitation of life itself. Not a hiding hole. A second civilization folded beneath the first. What a strange childhood that would make. A child born under stone, hearing stories about stars but not seeing them. Learning the routes through chambers before learning the feel of rain. Knowing filtered air, controlled light, echoing halls, and the distant hum of systems before ever walking through a surface dawn. If that happened even briefly, in some memory buried beneath later myth, no wonder the underworld became sacred in so many traditions. It was not simply the land of the dead. It was the place where life hid. And if you think about it long enough, the emotional inversion is almost overwhelming. The sky, usually the source of blessing, becomes threat. The earth, usually the place of burial, becomes mother and shield. That inversion may be one of the deepest memories the source is trying to touch. By the end of this part, the Abzu no longer feels like a side note in Sumerian religion. It feels like the hidden backbone of an entire survival strategy. Surface cities were masks, or at least partial masks. Beneath them lay the real guarantee, however fragile, that if the hunters returned, something would remain. Not only rulers, not only archives, populations, skills, systems, continuity. There is one more image I want to leave you with before we rise again. A chamber deep below Eridu, lit not by fire alone, but by some steadier inner glow that later ages would call divine because they had no better term. Around the perimeter, curved walls laced with materials hauled or made at tremendous effort. Along one side, conduits or channels humming with hidden flow. In the center, a still pool, or perhaps only the impression of a pool, because the old language cannot distinguish between water and power cleanly anymore. A few figures standing there, listening to reports from above, saying little, each aware that the installation around them was built for exactly this kind of night. And in the next part, we follow the warning itself. because all of these hidden places existed for one reason more than any other. Something was coming, something dark enough to be tracked not by light, but by what happened to light around it, and the old astronomers watched for it with a patience so enormous that they buried its path inside kings, calendars, and numbers. Once you accept that the underground world existed for a reason, the next question arrives almost on its own. What exactly were they waiting for? The source answers with one of its most chilling ideas: the destroyer star. Not a poetic omen alone. Not merely an evil planet in the loose mythic sense. A dark celestial pursuer, trailing the path of Nibiru through immense cycles. Difficult to see directly, but impossible to ignore if you knew how to watch the distortions it caused. In the source's telling, this object, or system of objects, was the physical sign of the cosmic threat that drove the Anunnaki from their earlier home and kept Earth in a state of long-defended vigilance. I have always found it more disturbing when a danger can be detected only by what it does to other things. A visible enemy, at least, grants the body something simple to fear, but an invisible one, known only by dimmed stars, bent paths, strange tides, and altered magnetic moods. That kind of threat enters the imagination differently. It makes the whole sky feel untrustworthy, as though any calm field of stars might already contain something moving through it without permission. The source says the ancient astronomers tracked exactly that. Babylonian tablets, Egyptian sky records, Chinese observations, Mayan calculations, Aztec codices, Andean traditions, all preserving, in very different languages, a pattern of attention directed towards something dark that moved with intention and consequence. The object was not always called the same thing. Of course, dark star, shadowbringer, serpent, jaguar between the stars, condor of darkness. Names change by landscape and worldview, but the emotional fingerprint remains steady. Something follows. Something hunts. Something cannot be seen cleanly, yet announces itself through disturbance. If you were standing here with me, I would ask you to imagine an ancient observatory at the edge of night. Not necessarily a grand stone tower every time. Sometimes only a roof. Sometimes a marked platform. Sometimes a quiet priest with clay tablets and a polished instrument. The air cooling after dusk. Oil lamps kept shielded. One assistant murmuring numbers, another tracing a line already known by heart. They are not searching for beauty. Not tonight. They are looking for deviation. A star slightly displaced. A path slightly bent. A dimming where no cloud belongs. The body of the observer grows more tense, not because he sees the hunter directly, but because the heavens around it begin behaving badly. That is the mood I think the source captures best. The destroyer star does not enter myth like a glowing heroic planet. It enters as pressure on the system. Other stars seem to flee before it. Background light dims. Planetary rhythms stutter. Eclipses arrive with disturbing irregularities. The ancients, in this story, become experts not in seeing the thing itself, but in reading the wounds it leaves in the sky as it passes. The Babylonian material is the first to speak in this language. Dark star. Shadow without light. a body that bends the paths of wandering ones. You can hear how translation itself strains under descriptions like that. Modern people immediately think of gravity, lensing, field effects, and mass hidden from direct view. Ancient observers would not have had our vocabulary, but they did have patience, mathematics, and a need sharp enough to make precision feel sacred. The source insists that their calculations were not decorative astrology. They were defense work. That reclassifies the observatory itself, no longer merely a holy place where priest astronomers perform the ritual marriage of kingship and heaven. It becomes part of the warning network. A station. A listening post. A high, quiet node in the long attempt to know how much time remained before the next approach. I find it oddly moving that so much of ancient authority may have depended on watching a sky that was expected to misbehave again. The calm of civilization above. Trade. Law. Hymn. Harvest. All resting on the thin, invisible discipline of a few people who stayed awake long enough to notice that a certain star should not be where it was. The source adds another layer that deepens the unease. The destroyer star may not have traveled alone. Satellite bodies, offspring of the shadow mother in one tradition, eyes of the hunter in another, smaller formations moving with apparent independence but under one larger strategic pattern. Once that enters the story, the heavens cease to be a field and become a formation. Reconnaissance units, detached observers, smaller threats sent ahead or to the sides. It is one thing to imagine a vast dark object cycling near the system. It is worse to imagine it deploying attention. Imagine an observer in Babylon tracing a familiar region of sky and realizing that the main disturbance is accompanied by smaller secondary irregularities. Not random. Coordinated. A subtle formation where no visible bodies can be seen. You can almost feel the dryness in his mouth as he marks the clay and says very little, because naming such a thing aloud would make it more real for everyone present. The source says the records do not stop at astronomy. They connect approach cycles to earthly disturbances, magnetic changes, auroral anomalies, weather disorder, rivers behaving strangely, seasons touched by wrongness. The sky does not merely announce the object. Earth answers it. That is why traditions around the world, in the source's view, preserve not only stories of dark celestial hunters, but practical defensive responses, underground activation, communication blackout, ritual or operational silence, reduced surface activity during certain alignments. All of that begins to sound less like random taboo and more like inherited emergency protocol. Some scholars would say this is a bridge too far. We should let myth remain myth. Fair enough, but the source is not really interested in permission. It wants to show how strangely precise many of these memories become once you stop assuming they must be symbolic first. A dark object approaching in cycles, observed through its effects, anticipated through calculations, correlated with catastrophe, matched by defensive architecture below ground. Once all of those pieces lie on the table together, the old stories no longer feel comfortably separate. The Mayan material is especially haunting in this context. The source treats the long count not just as a calendar of kings and ceremonies, but as a deep time warning system tuned to cycles much larger than ordinary dynastic history. The jaguar that hunts between the stars. The hidden approach measured across immense spans. Astronomical mathematics so patient that it begins to feel almost tender in its seriousness. It is as if the civilization accepted that no single generation would own the full problem, so the numbers themselves had to carry it forward. I have always loved that idea, and feared it a little too. A people building memory into mathematics because speech is too fragile. A threat so slow and so recurring that it must be written into calendars, not only into stories. Children born under one phase of the count, dying long before the next full danger arrives, and yet still taught to preserve the sequence, because one day the sky will need to be read correctly again. The source extends that same emotional structure to Egypt. The serpent that drinks the strength of Ra. Disturbances in the planet's order. Temple sky records functioning not as decoration, but as inherited tactical astronomy. Even eclipse irregularities, in the source's view, become signs of the larger hidden mass at work. That detail feels especially elegant. A civilization watches the moon cover the sun and notices that the timing is wrong, or increasingly wrong, or wrong in the same way every great cycle. Over centuries, wrongness becomes data. Data becomes forecast. Forecast becomes survival. There is also something deeply eerie in the Chinese material as the source presents it. Dragons that swim through the night sea without direct visibility. Invisible stars, whose presence is detected through the disturbances they create in known celestial relationships. You can almost feel how calm and methodical that observational culture would have to become to take such a thing seriously. Not every fear needs noise. Sometimes dread is only a brush mark on paper and a quiet decision to send the warning onward. And then the source returns to one of its largest and most disorienting ideas. The destroyer star's approach may have been tied to increased communication from hostile or external entities. That is to say, the sky did not just darken. The veil thinned. The same sort of whispers that reached the Igigi in the mines may have become easier during these cycles. Sightings increased. Strange aerial activity multiplied. Portents and voices and impossible phenomena clustered around periods of gravitational or magnetic disturbance. In the source's logic, this is not supernatural theater. It is an operational condition. The approach of the dark object creates channels, openings, or signal advantages through which the wider threat can observe, communicate, or intervene more directly. Imagine a city beneath one of these approach phases. At first, life is normal enough. Markets, lamps, temple smoke, children, the ordinary aching beauty of human routine. Then gradually, very gradually, things begin slipping. Compasses or their ancient equivalents misbehave. The air during night watches feels charged. Animals react badly. Astronomers request repeated observations. Then come the stories. Someone heard a voice in the outer court. Someone saw a shape in the sky that made no sound. Someone dreamed too vividly of darkness moving with purpose. By the time the official warning comes, if it comes, the body of the city already knows something is wrong. That may be why the source treats the ancient warning network as something almost sacred in itself. It was not only about prediction. It was about emotional management, giving a civilization enough notice to move below, to dim activity, to conceal what must be concealed, and perhaps to pray if prayer still had any place beside calculation. There is a line in the source's broader logic that I find almost painfully elegant. The old civilizations may have become religious around the sky because the sky really was the place where danger, memory, and meaning kept arriving together. In such a world, astronomy and theology would be almost impossible to separate. Watching the heavens would not feel like science in our narrow modern sense, nor like devotion alone. It would feel like both. A child of fear and reverence. That is the right mood for this part. Not excitement about exotic celestial mechanics. Reverent fear. The observatory as chapel and bunker sensor combined. The stars above as scripture and threat surface. By now, the fire in our little room should feel lower again. The shadows longer. The image I want to leave you with is a simple one. An old astronomer, perhaps in Babylon, perhaps in Maya lands, perhaps in a stone observatory, whose culture later called the threat by another name entirely. He is seated. A tablet or codex before him. The night clear. He marks a number, then another. He looks up. The stars seem calm to anyone less trained. Yet he knows that one small deviation has returned. One old pattern is beginning again. Somewhere below him, far below, hidden chambers exist for exactly this reason. Somewhere within the ruling class, messages are moving already. Somewhere the surface world is being quietly prepared for reduced light, reduced noise, reduced visibility, because something is coming nearer. And, in the next part, the source says the proof of that warning system was hidden in plain sight all along, inside the impossible reigns of the Sumerian king list, and in the vast, patient calendars of ancient timekeeping, where chronology may not have been simple history at all, but encrypted memory of the hunter's cycle and the long mathematics of survival. By the time the source reaches the Sumerian king list again, it asks us to do something that feels almost rude at first. It asks us to stop reading the list as if it were only trying to impress us. That is difficult, because the list has spent generations doing exactly that. Enormous reigns. Impossible durations. Kings before the flood ruling for spans so large they seem to belong to dream rather than government. Most readers either file the numbers under myth and move on, or they linger over them as evidence of pure fantasy. The source takes a stranger path. It suggests the numbers may not be boasting at all. They may be code. Not code in the childish treasure map sense. Code in the old civilizational sense. Information folded into a form that can survive long enough to reach people who still know how to unfold it. I have always loved that possibility, partly because it is so sad. Imagine a world in which the most dangerous knowledge cannot be written openly. Not because the scribes are foolish, but because they know texts travel. Conquerors take archives. Priests reinterpret them. Children inherit them without context. Enemies may read them too. So if you must preserve the rhythm of a cosmic threat, the timing of a returning hunter, the intervals between relative safety and near approach, you hide those measures inside the only thing everyone agrees must be copied carefully. Kings. That is the emotional logic the source gives the list. The first ruler, the impossible years, the second ruler, another impossible span, and so on. Under ordinary reading, it sounds inflated. Under this darker reading, it starts to sound measured. The numbers repeat in suspicious ways. They align with long cycles. They cluster around patterns too neat to be accidental once you begin testing them against orbital time, threat intervals, and defensive phases. The source claims these reigns preserve not only memory, but mathematics. The old list may not be telling us how long a king sat on a throne. It may be telling us how long a warning window stayed open, how many cycles the hunter remained in a stable pursuit pattern, how often the sky had to be watched with full attention. If you were standing here with me, I would ask you to imagine the scene in which this decision was made. A scribe in a guarded chamber, clay prepared. A supervisor or priest, or perhaps someone closer to the old technical class leaning over the table. The public version of the past must be preserved. The true version cannot vanish. The compromise is elegant and a little heartbreaking. Write the kings. Keep the names. Give them lengths that no ordinary future reader will understand literally, but that a trained observer, one with the right astronomical keys, may one day decode. A reign becomes a cycle. A dynasty becomes a defensive phase. History becomes the soft blanket thrown over a table full of instruments when strangers are walking by. The source goes even farther than that. It says the names themselves may matter, that certain rulers traditionally treated as semi-divine ancestors may actually mark specific functions in the old warning network. Founders become watchers. Bright rulers become developers of countermeasures. Purifying rulers become those who managed recovery after contact or contamination. The list, in this reading, stops being a parade of impossible kings and becomes something like an encrypted operations archive. Dry on the surface, trembling underneath. What I find so persuasive about that, at least emotionally, is how well it fits the whole tone of the story so far. Refuge, defensive cities, underground systems, astronomers tracking the destroyer star. Why would a civilization preserve all of that in straightforward language if concealment had already become part of survival? It would not. It would encode. It would ritualize. It would let future ages think the old numbers were vanity, if vanity was safer than understanding. Picture a later student reading the list centuries after the original danger has faded a little. He sees kings of impossible duration and shakes his head in respectful confusion. The names are still copied. The numbers are still preserved. Their outer meaning remains intact enough for tradition. Their inner meaning sleeps. That is the perfect hiding place for a warning. In plain sight, protected by reverence, dismissed by literalism. The source also points out the shift between the pre-flood and post-flood sections, and this is where the mood changes beautifully. Before the flood, the numbers stretch into those vast, impossible spans, regular, grand, almost geological in scale. After the flood, the durations collapse downward. Suddenly, the list begins to feel more human, more historical, more plausible to the surface eye. Traditional readings see that as myth giving way to history. The source sees something more tactical. Before the flood, The threat followed one long cyclical pattern tied to deep celestial movement. After the flood, the conditions changed. The danger became more immediate, more local to the system, more entangled with planetary alignments and closer disturbances rather than only the grand, slow return of a pursuer in the outer dark. That shift in number style, if the source is right, is not literary convenience. It is a change in battle space. Honestly, that phrase should not feel so natural when talking about ancient king lists. And yet here we are. Once the story has taught you to look for fear hidden beneath order, even mathematics begins to carry emotional weather. The earlier ages feel long, slow, suspended. The drawn-out tension of knowing something is out there and tracking it over immense distances. The later ages feel quicker, sharper, more unstable, as if the conflict has come nearer and time itself has become more expensive. The cities tied to these rulers begin to shift in meaning too. Eridu is not simply first city. It is first watch station. Bad Tibira is not simply a sacred industrial center. It becomes a development zone for defensive technologies. Uruk becomes something closer to a command center, a place where later rulers and heroes, Gilgamesh among them, are remembered not only as sovereigns, but as operators, observers, those who had access to hidden systems beneath the polite surface of kingship. I have always found Gilgamesh especially moving in this kind of reading. We think of him as heroic, restless, grieving, proud. All of that remains. But the source adds another layer. His epithets and remembered actions may point not only to symbolic heroism, but to technical access. Someone who saw the deep, someone who moved between surface civilization and the hidden infrastructure beneath it. Someone who inherited fragments of a much older emergency framework, already becoming myth in his own lifetime. That gives his whole story a tired grandeur. He is not merely a king struggling with mortality. He may be the late inheritor of a defensive world whose original purpose is already slipping away. And once that thought enters the room, the king list becomes almost unbearably poignant. Because it is no longer just a list. It is a long effort to remember correctly, while pretending not to remember too much. The source says other cultures did similar things. Calendars, dynastic counts, sacred cycles, names attached to durations that may have carried astronomical warning functions in addition to ceremonial or historical meaning. The Maya are an obvious parallel here, but not the only one. The deeper pattern is simple and sad. Civilizations threatened by slow recurring danger do not always preserve their fear in plain story. Often they preserve it in recurrence, in numbers, in temple alignments, in festival timing, in the little habits of official memory that later ages call religion because they no longer know the original emergency. If you were standing here with me now, I would ask you to imagine a royal archive at night. Shelves, clay, a single lamp, perhaps dust drifting in the heat above the flame. Outside, the city is asleep. Inside, a record keeper presses one more line into the list of rulers. The action looks calm, administrative, almost boring. Yet the number he chooses, or preserves, or copies exactly from an older source, may carry the pulse of a threat that no ordinary reader around him fully grasps. There is something beautiful in that restraint. The world may forget what the numbers mean. The numbers are kept anyway, and that may be the real miracle of old records. Not that they speak plainly, but that they endure long enough to be asked the right question. The source asks that question ruthlessly. What if the king list is a warning machine disguised as history? What if chronology itself was used as concealment? What if time was the safest vault of all? Once you think that way, every impossible reign begins to feel less ridiculous. Not immediately understandable, no, but purposeful, deliberate. Someone wanted these values preserved. Someone wanted them copied with reverence, even after their literal sense became implausible. That is a very clever way to protect dangerous information from both destruction and misuse. Make it sacred. Make it boring. Make it impossible enough that ordinary minds will either obey it or ignore it, but never quite unfold it. The source leaves us there for a while, and I think it is right to do so. The mood of this section should not be rushed. The old clay deserves time. The old numbers deserve silence around them. The king list is one of those artifacts that modern people think they understand because they know what it is called. Yet titles can be very misleading. A king list may not only be a king list. A temple may not only be a temple. A hymn may not only be a hymn. Once the possibility of concealment enters the story, every category grows porous, and the source has one final move before it hands us into the closing darkness. If the threat calculations were hidden in the king list, then the people who inherited these texts were already living inside a world of deliberate forgetting. The concealment was not an accident of time. It was policy. A civilization under enough pressure had chosen to let future generations remember only the outer shell of its fear. That means the burial of the truth was already underway long before later empires, later priesthoods, and later scholars added their own layers. In other words, the hiding became tradition. That may be the bleakest detail of all. Not that the truth was lost, that it was taught to disappear gracefully. There is also one almost cruel elegance in the whole arrangement. Future readers would stare at those vast reigns and argue over whether the ancients were naive, symbolic, priestly, or simply extravagant, while the original scribes may have intended exactly that confusion. The absurdity protected the pattern. It made the wrong kind of reader walk away. Yet beneath that protective absurdity sits something unexpectedly tender. The people who encoded these warnings believed that some distant future mind might still deserve them. Some age, calmer or more desperate, might finally ask why the numbers feel patterned rather than random, why they contract when the world changes, why chronology suddenly behaves like a machine, pretending to be ancestry. When I sit with that too long, the king list stops feeling like a boast and starts feeling like a survival gesture. A reign can endure in a library when an observatory cannot. A sacred sequence can travel through conquest when a direct warning would be burned. A child can memorize names and durations without realizing he is preserving the pulse of an older fear. That is such an ancient kind of hope. Slow, stubborn, and humble enough to hide inside clerical routine. So let us leave the archive now, with the lamp still low and the clay still warm from the scribe's hands. The kings stand in their long, impossible rows. Their numbers look absurd to the casual eye. Their patience feels almost gentle. But underneath them, the sky still turns, the hunter still cycles, and the old defensive memory keeps its place by pretending to be chronology. In the final part, we step into the long burial of that memory itself. When technical language became myth, warning became religion, and the record of a hunted world was folded so carefully into sacred story that most people would one day call it fantasy and walk away. Maybe that is why the story refuses both easy belief and easy ridicule. Both are escapes from the same discomfort. Belief says the burden is over. Ridicule says the burden never existed. The source asks us to stay in the middle place where fragments remain. Patterns insist, and old institutions begin to look less like guardians of pure truth than caretakers of whatever version of the past keeps society from shaking too hard. That is why the recurring motifs matter. Dust on clay, water under stone, candlelight in archives, river breath around first settlements, numbers shrinking after catastrophe. These are not only atmosphere, they are the aftertaste of concealment, the emotional residue of a world that first hid from the sky and then learned to hide from itself. Enough remains for discomfort. Enough remains for rereading. Enough remains for nights like this, when an old king list stops sounding pompous and starts sounding frightened, and when the oldest question quietly changes from who ruled the earth to what made even the rulers afraid. If the source is right, the oldest deception was not a single lie. It was a patient softening. A technical term replaced by a sacred one. A defensive report turned into a hymn. A record of pursuit transformed into a creation myth. A weapon renamed as wind. A surveillance network recast as divine omniscience. A refugee civilization elevated into a pantheon of cosmic rulers because rulers feel easier to worship than refugees, and gods are less embarrassing to inherit than frightened ancestors who hid underground. That is the final movement of the story tonight, and in some ways it is the saddest, because by the time we reach it, the Great Sky War has already happened. The workers have already been compromised. The underground shelters have already been built. The destroyer star has already been tracked, and the warning cycles have already been buried in lists of kings. What remains is not the immediate terror of the old crisis. What remains is the long effort to cover it so thoroughly that future generations will no longer understand what their own oldest records are trying to say. The source describes this as a deliberate campaign, and whether one takes that literally or more loosely as a civilizational drift toward myth, the emotional effect is the same. The truth is not smashed. It is wrapped. I have always found wrapping more haunting than destruction. A burned archive is tragic, but straightforward. A wrapped archive still exists. It waits. It keeps breathing through the fabric placed over it. People continue touching it, revering it, teaching it, never realizing their hands are only inches from something much more dangerous and much more concrete than the official explanation allows. Imagine one of those transition moments. An Akkadian scribe inherits an older Sumerian tablet. He can still read enough of the older technical language to know it is awkward, specific, and not especially helpful to the devotional or imperial framework now taking shape around him. He has choices. He can preserve the old terms and risk unsettling interpretation. He can destroy the text and lose the authority it carries. Or he can translate softly. the machine becomes a wind. The hidden power becomes divine radiance. The pursuer becomes chaos. The watch network becomes the eyes of heaven. The result is beautiful, durable, and much safer. It also begins the slow burial of history under poetry. The source insists this happened again and again. Mesopotamian materials were standardized. Earlier technical shades were eased into theological narratives. Military conflict in the sky became creation drama. Refuge and concealment became sacred mystery. The old accounts were not entirely erased because they were too foundational, too beloved, too structurally useful. Instead, they were lifted away from engineering and pushed toward myth. That way, the record could survive while its most destabilizing meaning faded from ordinary view. And then, because history has a way of teaching systems to imitate what once protected them, later civilizations continued the work. Egypt transformed old memories into temple theology. Greece inherited fragments already softened and made them philosophical, moral, heroic. Rome absorbed and organized. Christianity spiritualized. Islam reinterpreted through its own grand framework of divine causation and prophetic order. Medieval scholarship copied what it had while smoothing whatever still sounded too technical or too disruptive. By the time modernity arrived, the old stories had been translated so many times across fear, faith, politics, and prestige that the original pulse of emergency was barely audible. Barely. Not gone. That matters. The source is almost tender in how it treats surviving fragments. The truth, if truth it was, did not vanish cleanly. It persisted in odd terminology, impossible numbers, awkward metaphors, buried structures, and visual details too specific to sit comfortably inside, pure symbolism. The old texts continued to leak. A wheel that moves wrongly. A weapon that sounds too exact. A king list that behaves like mathematics. A hymn that reads like a disguised engineering note. The concealment campaign worked, yes, but never so perfectly that every seam disappeared. I think that is why the story feels so haunting at the end. Not because it achieves proof, but because it suggests why proof is so difficult. We are not looking at a clean, ruined city. We are looking at a city rebuilt again and again on top of itself, each generation repainting the older walls in the colors of its own certainty. And the source does not stop with antiquity. It says the concealment is still alive. Not in precisely the same forms, perhaps, but in familiar mechanisms. Academic gatekeeping, institutional caution, professional ridicule, classification, the filtering of discoveries into acceptable narratives before the public is allowed to see them. The framing of every technological anomaly in ancient contexts as either primitive ingenuity, harmless symbolism, or fringe fantasy. In that sense, the modern world, for all its science, may still be acting like the old priesthood. Protect the structure of meaning first. Ask the most dangerous questions last. If at all. That does not mean every archaeologist or historian is part of a plot. The truth is usually gentler and more human than that. Most people simply inherit categories and defend them because a world without them feels unstable. I've always tried to remember that when reading material like this, A scholar does not need to be malicious to resist a theory that would force history, religion, and human identity to bend all at once. Ordinary caution can do the work of concealment just as well as conspiracy. Still, the source's final point lingers. If humanity really grew under the shadow of extraterrestrial refuge, cosmic pursuit, engineered labor, and long defensive concealment, then our oldest religions may preserve not the fantasy of frightened primitives, but the carefully softened afterimage of a world that knew too much and decided most of that knowledge was unsafe to leave in plain sight. That would mean mythology is not childish error. It is protective translation. I find that idea almost beautiful. A frightened civilization gathers its most dangerous truths and wraps them in story so their shape will survive, even if their sharp edges must be hidden. Later ages inherit the stories and think they are only stories. Yet the old emotional pressure remains inside them. That is why the myths often feel both absurd and unreasonably serious at the same time. They are carrying more than they are allowed to explain. If you were standing here with me now, perhaps with the fire nearly down to embers, I would ask you to imagine the very last custodians of that old knowledge. Not the first builders, not the sky watchers in their towers, not the engineers below the earth. The last custodians, the ones who know the outer shell is becoming all most people will remember. They sit in libraries, temples, scriptoria, royal archives. They decide what to preserve openly, what to veil, what to burn, what to redirect into devotion, what to encode into dynastic time, what to let become allegory. It is not difficult to imagine the grief in that work. To know a thing plainly, then watch history demand that you preserve it only in disguise. Maybe that is why so many sacred traditions are full of double speech. One level for the people, another level for the initiated. One level for comfort, another for warning. One for worship, another for memory. The source takes that ancient pattern and gives it its bleakest reading. The second level was never only mystical. It was historical, technical, defensive, a way of carrying forward what the surface world could not safely hear. And now here we are, centuries deep into the disguise, with museum labels and university departments and documentaries and late-night listeners beside the fire, trying to decide whether the old records are fantasies, codes, softened trauma, or some uneasy mixture of all three. I do not think the source expects a neat answer. It expects pressure. Pressure on the accepted narrative. Pressure on the clean divide between myth and history. Pressure on the idea that ancient people could not possibly have been preserving memories of technological beings and cosmic threat. In that sense, the buried truth is not a single recovered fact. It is a shift in posture, a willingness to look at the oldest material and stop assuming it must be simple because it is old. The source ends with one last heavy thought, and it is worth letting it settle slowly. Humanity may not be ignorant by accident, not only because time destroys, though it does, not only because empires burn records, though they do, but because some truths were hidden on purpose, hidden by those who feared what would happen if the hunted condition of the Anunnaki, and the hunted condition inherited by humanity after them, remained fully visible to every generation. If that is so, then our ignorance has a design to it. not perfect design. Frayed, compromised, leaking at the edges. But design all the same. That is a hard thing to carry to bed. So let us soften it without losing it. The clay still exists. The king lists still exist. The hymns still exist. The buried chambers still exist, at least in part. The old myths still breathe. Whatever was wrapped was not destroyed completely. The world has not forgotten with total success. It has only forgotten unevenly. And uneven memory is why nights like this are possible at all. The questions survive because something survived well enough to keep asking them. So let the room grow quieter now. Let the old cities sink back into darkness. Let Eridu rest above its hidden deep. Let the workers in the mines set down their tools. Let the watchers withdraw into cloud and height. Let the destroyer star continue its vast cold cycle beyond ordinary sight. Let the scribes place one more softened phrase onto one more tablet and look away for a moment, longer than usual before the lamp is covered. You do not have to solve any of it tonight. It is enough to feel how different the old world becomes when the gods are no longer comfortable conquerors, but hunted exiles. It is enough to notice how walls, numbers, hymns, and myths all begin leaning in the same direction once fear is allowed back into the story. It is enough to understand that buried truth rarely vanishes. It simply learns to sleep under sacred language until someone gentle, stubborn, or foolish enough begins listening closely again. And perhaps that is the strangest comfort of all. The past may be darker than we were taught, but it is also more alive. The clay still presses upward through the layers laid over it. The old warnings still flicker inside the numbers. The myths still hold their shape around what they were asked to hide. And somewhere between history and dream, the hunted still keep watch. Good night.